My name is Mary Maestri Vaughn. My date of birth is October the 30th, 1927.
Thank you. And where were you born?
I was born in Taneytown, Arkansas. Dr. Cooper from Elm Springs delivered me, a home delivery.
And you signed the release form, but we just want you to say on the video that we have your permission to do the interview.
I signed your release form giving you permission to do my interview.
Thank you so much. Okay, first question is, who were your parents?
My parents were Albano Maestri and Agnes Pierce Maestri.
Okay, tell me a little bit about them. First your dad and then your mom.
My dad was born in Italy, came to Taneytown in 1895 through New Orleans when he was 5 years old. My mother was born in Kentucky, moved into Missouri, and then moved into Taneytown in the, I'd say, 1918, somewhere in that era.
Okay. Tell me about your grandparents, first on your father's side.
The only my grandparents, first on my dad's side, I never knew. They died before I was born. But I do know stories about them. They were farmers. They lived south of Taneytown, down as you make the curve past the cemetery. In fact, they donated the land for the Taneytown Cemetery out of part of their farm. And they were basically farmers.
And then on your mother's side, her parents were?
I never knew my grandmother. My grandmother Emma died before I was born. But my grandfather, Frank Pierce, lived with us all my life. One of my earliest memories is sitting in a high chair and him feeding me in the kitchen of our house.
Tell me about your family when you were growing up as a child. Who were your siblings, your brothers and sisters?
Well, there were 9 of us. Okay. There were 9 siblings in my family as I was growing up. My oldest brother was Floyd, and then my sister Genevieve, and then my sister Grace, and my sister Lavinia, and my brother Stephen, myself, my brother Paul, my brother Frank, and now my baby brother is 10 years younger than I am, and his name is Leslie.
Okay. Tell me, what kind of business was your family in?
Well, my dad, through the years, did a variety of things, but when he was started in business, he owned a store in middle of Taneytown, and he had a grocery store during the 30s, and with the grocery store he repaired flats and took care of some minor things on automobiles. He ran the grocery store during the 30s, but due to the fact that it was a depression and people put things on charge accounts and were not able to pay, he lost the business. And then he started trucking produce from farm to market. He went to the open market in Tulsa with produce. I have one story that tells you a lot about my father. He would take one of the children in the family with him on these trips occasionally. And my oldest sister lived in Tulsa, and I went with him. And when he had a younger man who was his partner, and when we got to the open market, we were walking along, and we came to his booth, and there was a man next to him, and he greeted the two men, and he said, "Oh, I want to tell you this joke." And he started telling a off-colored joke. And my daddy took my hand and started walking away. And I heard the man say, "Oh, I forgot about the child." And the other man said, "Albana would have walked away anyway." So that's who my daddy was.
Any lessons you learned from his business that you want to share?
I was too young at that time to really remember much about the business. My memories of Taneytown are just growing up with a large family and having a multitude of friends and a lot of freedom.
Well, what would you do to help out in the family business or to help out around the home? What was your job when you were little?
When I was little, my first chore was supper dishes. And there was no such thing as a dishwasher. So you heated the water on the wood stove, and then you had what you washed them in and then what you rinsed them in. And that, for many, many years, that was my main chore. But we helped in the garden, and we moved from the house downtown to east toward Springdale, next to the schoolyard, and Daddy started raising chickens. And during lunch hour, we would go home to water chickens every day.
What are your earliest memories of Taneytown?
My earliest memories are living, we called it the bungalow. It is still there. It is a business right by Pam Trucking. That little white house was where I was raised. And we had, there was a big building off to the side of it that Dad stored things in. And of course there were no indoor bathrooms. That's where the privy was. And next, before you got to that, was a wood pile. And Daddy stacked the wood on 3 sides, and that was my playhouse. It was a hard dirt floor, and that's where I played for many years.
What are some, you said you were talking about this, your dad's store. What other local stores and businesses do you remember in Taneytown?
Well, catty-cornered across from the church was the Perona store, which was a 2-story brick building. The Peronas lived upstairs, and they had the store downstairs. And there was a garden between them and our house. And Mother and Miss Perona were very, very good friends. And then there was another store as you turn on Barrington and go south. That was John Malara's store. It was actually owned by Frank Bodino, but Mr. Malara married Frank's sister. He was a Frenchman of royalty that for years received money, but may I tell you a little about the store?
Sure, tell me about the store.
Mother sewed. She sewed for herself and for other people. And she would send me down the little alley behind the Perona store across the Barrington into Mr. Millar's to get sewing threads and different items. And when you entered the store, it was dark except for a small light. On the left, there was a long counter where he kept candy and a few groceries. And as you went in the store, he would greet you. And depending on what you wanted, he had a string of twine all over that building. And if you said, I need to spool of thread, he'd look up and pull one string, and back in the other corner, light would come on. And that would be where he had that. And depending on what item you want, it was amazing. He was, I did a story about him for the bulletin one time. He was a wonderful man, but a character. He wore a white suit on Sunday, played the organ in church, rang the bell for every occasion, for lunchtime, every day for church. But at night, he would walk the cemetery saying his rosary, wearing this white suit. He did that all his life.
Any other stores or owners you remember?
Well, later, the Artemanis, Richard and Bee, built a big grocery store across the street from Perona's. And by then, we had moved down to the 20 acres on the other side of the school, and everybody charged, and you would pay your bill. And I always loved it when Daddy paid the grocery bill, because he would come home with apples and oranges and candy.
Let's see. What restaurants do you remember back in those days and later? Where would you eat if you did eat out?
We really did not have any restaurants to begin with when I was young in Taneytown. You ate at home, or I'll tell you how we lived. Daddy rented land 1.5 miles. We went down Barrington and then back up and put in strawberries from Jean Artemani. And he would get all of the younger, when the strawberries were ripe, he would stop at the grocery store, and they had salami, or bologna they called it. It wasn't really salami, hanging by the cash register. And Dad would go in and say, slice me off that much, and he'd pick up crackers, maybe some cans of sardine, and we'd go to the field to work. And the first restaurant that went in that I remember is the Venetian Inn. And it was put in by two very interesting Italian men that were not from Taneytown, but they both married Montagani girls. And the Venetian Inn, nearly every woman in Taneytown has worked at the Venetian Inn in some capacity at one time or another. And it's still a great restaurant. But it's named the Venetian Inn. You would think it's because they're Italian. But the reason that Stoffi called it the Venetian Inn was because he put in all these Venetian blinds. He had a sense of humor.
Talk to me about the cabins that were there. What were they, and why were they there at first? Or they may still be, but the Venetian, the lodge.
The tourist court. I'm not really sure when that went in, but they rented, especially during harvest seasons, and they did, some people lived in them permanently. You know, they would pay by the week in the later years. But the people who owned it, they were the Granada family. and it went from different members of that family during different years. But like I said, many, many women in Taneytown, and some still work at the Venetian Inn. It's still a nice place to eat. And they had a lot of their patronage was University of Arkansas students. You could get a steak that would fill a platter and heaping spaghetti and rolls for a very nominal fee. And one time I took, we were out eating with my firstborn. He was still in a high chair. And there were some young university boys eating next to us, and one of them used a pretty strong curse word. And my little son stood up in his high chair and very loudly pronounced, "Daddy, that man said a bad word, he said," and repeated the word, brought the house down. But Alice Granada she and her husband ran it for many, many years, and she was a very interesting, lovable person. And she might have 25 people waiting in line, and if she wanted to pull out somebody special, she knew how to do it.
What about the other restaurants in town?
Well, there was Aunt Mary's, and my Aunt Mary Maestri opened a restaurant in her home and ran it for years, and then her son Ed took over and ran it, and then her grandson Danny just closed it last year, I think. It's been in the family for years. But Aunt Mary restaurant, and then there was a small cafe run by different people during the years, which was about almost a mile west of Taneytown, and behind it was a dance hall and a baseball field. So it was the place to go. And they served breakfast and lunch. It was more reasonable in price, and you could get a variety of foods. And through the years, a number of people owned it, but I remember Fern and Bill Fiore had it for a long time. And that was during the World War II, when they were running it. Earl Mercino came home from the war, and he wanted to walk from Springdale to Taneytown because he wanted to take in everything. And Bill saw him coming. He got to the restaurant, it was just about breakfast time. So the story is Bill runs out to greet Earl, pulls him in, and fed him breakfast before he went on home.
What was the name of the restaurant, if you remember?
The Luncheonette. That's the only name that I remember. Like I said, I think it was started by the Monteganis, but my memory of it is when Bill and Fern owned it, and it was called the Luncheonette.
Tell me the story about how Aunt Mary learned how to make spaghetti and what her heritage was.
My Aunt Mary was an Irish nurse, and I don't know how she met my Uncle Aldo, but when they married, they moved in with my grandparents, and my grandparents could not speak English. So Aunt Mary said she knew right away she had to learn Italian, and in the process, my grandmother, Nona we called her, taught Aunt Mary how to cook, how to make spaghetti. And her business started because she knew Miss Marinoni who was a poet and was at the university. Her husband was a professor at the University of Arkansas. And Miss Marinoni talked Aunt Mary into making spaghetti for some of her friends. And from that, it grew. And there was a man in Springdale, his name escapes me right now. I hope it comes to me. But he was a bachelor, and he had many women friends. He was a great guy, and he owned an airplane. And when he wanted to eat with Aunt Mary, he would tie his reservation to a rock, how many was in the party, and he would circle her backyard until somebody came out, and he would drop the rock. And that's how they knew that they had the party from his that night. And when I was young, they would call reservations in to the, Aunt Mary had no home. They would call them into the store on the corner, the Artemani store. And all of my brothers and sisters and myself would take these, we'd meet one another sometime going down that road. And I can remember when the dust was up to my ankles, and I would be barefooted and going to Aunt Mary's carrying a reservation, and sometime about the time you got back to the store, there'd be another one. So we were that's how she got her start, was through word of mouth.
Any other stories you can remember about the restaurant?
I didn't work at the restaurant, but Fern Fiore and both of my sisters worked for Aunt Mary. And my Uncle Aldo made homemade wine. And when they started the restaurant, Aunt Mary had, it was a beautiful place. She had a lot of Italian tapestries on the wall. And as it grew, she started having to use the bedrooms to eat in. You may sit on the side of the bed in a little card table there with 2 or 3 other chairs and have your spaghetti dinner. And finally she took the beds out of most of the bedrooms and just turned them into places to serve. And Uncle Aldo never charged for wine, but he always had his big pitcher and went around, and he always poured wine for everybody that ate.
You talked earlier about where all you had lived. Did you just live in those 2 places, or where all have you lived?
In Taneytown, those 2 different homes.
Okay. Talk about what it was like attending school in Tontitown. Where did you go, and what was it like?
I had many good friends. I remember waiting to walk with Josephine and Catherine Piazza, who lived across from where the Venetian Inn, not the Venetian Inn, but Mama Z's is now, and about a mile west of Tontitown. And I would wait for the girls, and we would walk. And then my another dear friend of mine was Cordiana, when Father Bandini was there, they built a big hotel in Tontitown, which through the years just went out of business. And but during my years, the Cordianas lived in the hotel, and Mrs. Cordiana was a large woman, and she had 4 daughters, and they served beer at night and let men come and play cards, and I could always play with the girls till 5 o'clock, and then I had to come home. But it was a big hotel. I remember playing in the dining room and the dance hall, and it was a fun place growing up.
Tell me more about school. What was it like going there?
It's like there was bullying in school, just like there is today. I was bullied. But I had the Catholic Sisters of Mercy taught school, and I had some great school teachers, and I had some that were not so great. But when two of the nuns, I was married in the sisters' dining room. My husband and my husband was not a Catholic. He did not want a big wedding. So Father Schaefer was the priest at the time. And may I back up a little?
Sure.
When I was young, Father Schaefer was our priest. And one winter he got pleurisy. And he couldn't raise his arms to put on his cassock. And I went up every day, stood on a little stool behind him, would hold this, pretty tall man, this big black cassock, and he would get his arms in, then I'd go right around the front, and I'd button it all the way down the front. And that is one of my early memories, and he's the priest that married us. He was a wonderful, wonderful person. The memories of getting back to school, I went to school one day when I was in the 5th grade, and no one would talk to me. No one. This went on for about 3 days. And finally my friend, my Koreana friend I was telling you about, she came up to me and she said, Mary, she said, we're not supposed to talk to you, but I'm tired of this. And Beatrice Taldo had, for some reason, decided that she wanted to do this to me, and she had told everyone that they could not speak with me. And at the same time, there was a nun who I honestly think she was a little bit off. And I was talking to, when you would stand at noon, there was a prayer called the Angelus that you said. And we stood by our desk to say this prayer. And when we did, the boys would pull your hair, tickle the back of your neck. They tried to distract you. And Sister caught this going on one time, and she spent a good part of the morning moving all the desks. She put all the girls on that side and all the boys on this side and put me right in the middle of the boys. And she said, you like them so much you can just live with them. But I also, like I said, had there was Sister Agnes and Sister Jerome, Sister Bernadine. They were there when I was in school, and they were at my wedding in their dining room.
Talk about whenever you graduated from Taneytown, where your next school was. Where did you go after that?
I graduated. We went through the eighth grade at Taneytown, and my sister Genevieve lived in Tulsa, and they were quite away from the Catholic school, and her son was ready to start the 1st grade. So she and Mother exchanged children. I went to my first year of high school and lived with my sister, and of course I took the bus clear across town. And her son came and lived in Taneytown and went to 1st grade with my mother. And then the 2nd year, I went to the University of Arkansas. They had a high school where the teachers that were training to teach taught. They had supervisions. It was a wonderful school. I really enjoyed that year. And then the last 2 years I went back and started the 11th grade, and it was during nearly the end of the war, and they were calling family men, and my brother-in-law was called up. So I was left in Tulsa on my own. And I worked nights at the 3 big theaters in downtown Tulsa, the Ritz, the Orpheum, and the Majestic, and went to school days. And I lived with a friend of my sister who was a young woman. She was older than I. And we had a little apartment together, and I was able to pay rent. And when the sister superior, her name was Leonessa, found out about it, she called me in and she said, I don't want you working nights. It's just not safe. And the Catholic school took up the whole block except for one little corner that had a bakery. And the people that owned it were named Smith. And they were not Catholic, but they were dear friends of the nuns. So Sister Leonessa said, I've talked to Miss Smith, and you're going to live with them. And she said, you will leave school and go home and have their supper ready when they come home. And then they'll bring you in early in the morning, and you can help in the donut shop or bakery, really it was, until such time as school starts. And they were lovely. They had a daughter not much older than I that was married with a child, and she was really, I had, I think, more common sense than she did, but it was a wonderful time in my life. They were very, very good to me.
Who are some of, you mentioned some of them earlier, but who are some of your classmates in school at Taneytown?
Veronica Penalto. My classmates were Veronica Penalto and Imogene Artemani, Philip Penalto, and there were a lot of Penaltos, but they were not of the same family. They might be cousins or, distant relatives. And like I said, Rosalie was one of my best friends, and Patsy Taldo was a good friend. And her sister Beatrice is the one that gave me such a hard time all my life. And we were a close-knit group.
Who were when you were a kid, who were some of the older people in the community that you remember that maybe the ones that stand out? I mean, there were a lot of people you knew, but who were some of the ones that you remember from the town that we haven't already?
Well, I remember Mr. Millara, I remember Mr. Prona, Richard and B. Artemani were the older people, and if the Spinotos, I keep thinking of stories as I think of these names, which slows me down. But I remember that my brother Floyd, I have a bootlegging story from my brother Floyd, who was the oldest member of our family, sibling. And he and Bill Fiore, the picture that I gave you, knew where the men made their white lightning, what else did they call it? It was bootleg whiskey. And they would put it in quart jars, and to keep the revenuers from finding it, they would place it at different places on their farm. And Bill and Floyd knew where all these were hidden, and they would go and steal it and go up to the corner by the Artemani store and at night, and the people from Fayetteville would drive by and buy it from them. And Floyd said they got caught, and they were very young. He said they were spending it on cigarette money, and they had money they didn't know what to do with. And when they got caught, all the elders, they were put on trial. And he said, we never did it again.
We've talked some about this, but tell me again, when you were a little kid running around in Taneytown, what would you and your friends do for fun?
Well, when I was growing up in Taneytown, there wasn't a lot that you could do, but we made stilts. And that was, you had a brace that went under your arm, and they were tall, and then near the bottom, they would put a block of wood, and you could stand on it and walk. And the other thing was we would roll big, I don't know what they were made of, but they were a utility piece from a car or something. They were round, and we would try to keep them up and push them. And we played jacks a lot. And I have a jack story. Right in front of the school at Taneytown, as you would go up the steps to go in, I wasn't quite 6 years old, and I was watching all of these older girl, my older sister and all her friends, they pooled their jacks, and gosh, there was a lot of them, and they would throw them out on that big area and play jacks. And one time I was watching, and one of the jacks fell on the grass, and thinking nothing of it, I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I was 5.5 years old. And when they divided their jacks up, there was a jack missing, and oh, there was a commotion. And I was too scared to say that I had picked it up. So that's the first thing I confessed in confession, was that I stole a jack. I said, the only other thing I ever stole in my life was when I was a teenager, I guess, probably in the probably a sophomore in high school, at the Grape Festival one year. I was on the grounds, and I had posed for a picture with some grapes, and these university guys had seen me. So they came up to me and they said, we're on a scavenger hunt and we have to take home an Italian salami. Can you get us one? Well, my daddy had them in the cellar. And like I said, we were right next to the Grape Festival. And I said, yeah, I know where I can get one. So I went down and stole one of my daddy's salamis. And the next day, Dad said, you know, all the years that we've lived here and had the Grape Festival next door, I've never locked a door. No one's ever stole anything from me. But someone took a salami last night. I said, I confessed it to my priest, but I never told my father. It would have broke his heart.
What did the adults, your parents and their friends, do for fun back when you were a kid? What do you remember them doing for fun?
Well, my mother pretty much stayed at home. But when they first married, they used to go to different houses, and I think this was custom all over northwest Arkansas. They would clear a room in the house and have dances. There would be certain musicians, and they would have dances. But Mother was, she went to a couple and said that she didn't enjoy it, and so she and Dad never went. They played cards a lot. And Nova Jean Watson, whose husband was mayor at Taneytown a few years ago, was a Fury. And her grandmother had a back porch. She lived, as you turn on Barrington, right behind the Artemani store. The house is still there. It was the first house on your left. And her back porch was where she would serve wine and the men could come and play cards.
Tell me about some of your many memories of the Tontitown Grape Festival. What are your earliest memories of it, and what was it like?
First of all, my father, for many, many, many years, was the one that got the carnival for the Grape Festival. And it was Stumbo's Carnival, same one for years. And it was a great time. The Grape Festival started not at the location it is now, but where Barrington is. It was on. There was they owned a small. There was a small building on that property, and it had some land, and that's where the picnic started. And it was right across the street from our house uptown. And everybody that came to the picnic came to our house for a drink of water. They used our well. And the only thing they had was a Ferris wheel, and from the very beginning, the men in Taneytown had a hamburger booth where they made hamburgers. And I worked, not at that time, but when they moved on down on the other side of the church, I worked in the hamburger booth for a lot of times. And I sold car tickets as I got a little older. And 2 years ago, I was still selling car tickets. I didn't do it last year. I may go out and sell them this year. But, and by the way, they're having a car this year. But the picnic, the spaghetti dinners were what the Tontitown, they rented the land to they got so much from the carnival people. They didn't take a percentage, it was just a given amount. And then the carnival people, whatever they made was theirs. But the spaghetti dinners were what the Taneytown people made their living on. And they still serve unbelievable amounts every night.
What do you remember about the getting ready for the festival and all that?
It was very exciting. And they had getting ready for the festival. They had a picture booth that I wish at some point we would have during our November polenta smear that we have now, ask for pictures that came out of that booth, nothing else. Because if you had a boyfriend, everybody, I have one with my brother, I have one with my boyfriend at the time, and your best friends, you all had these little snapshots from the picture booth. And I remember the bingo was always a big thing, still is. And there was a woman here, I don't know if you've ever heard of White River Red. She was a woman that had a great history. She buried at Friendship Cemetery, and she was at the carnival every year. She had a mouse game. It was round with little holes, and you could put your money on where you thought the mouse was going to come up from. And everybody, she was a very charitable woman. but she came from a wealthy family in Missouri, ran away from home with the circus, and was on her own after that. But everybody in Northwest Arkansas knew White River Red. And I remember hers, I remember the picture booth and the hamburger booth, and there was another, excuse me, event in Taneytown that I'd like to tell you about that really was not associated with the carnival. But it was, Cap Tiller was his name, and he would come at least twice a year, and in the old building from the first Grape Festival grounds, he would show old movies. You got to see a lot of Westerns, and everybody looked forward to Cap Tiller. And I don't remember him ever being present during a picnic. But during the picnic, we would serve the meals in the basement of the schoolhouse, and I served a lot as I was growing up. All of us young girls did. And then we would clear everything out and have the dance in the basement. There were always dance every night.
What other local traditions or activities do you remember?
During the year, other than school functions, I really don't remember. I know that we visited in our own age group in our homes, and you know, we played spin the bottle and all those games, which was how you got to take a walk with your boyfriend. And have you ever heard of spin the bottle? Oh, I'm sorry. Even, you won't believe this, but we would sit on quilts in the front yard at night, and you would pick an automobile. Like I might pick a Ford, my brother might pick a Chevrolet, and you would see who won, how many came by. And there wouldn't be very many during the course of the evening, but the one that got the most make of the most cars won. And we played mumble peg. Have you ever played mumble? You know what mumble peg is? You play it with a knife, and you have all these different variety of things that you do. It's a pen knife, and it's open. I know one of them is you do this, hold it on your nose and see if you can stick it in the ground. Then you hold it on your ear and see if you can. They had all these different things that you did with the pen knife and see if you could get it to stick in the ground. And like I said, we played jack, we played count cars, pen knives, and spin the bottle. We never really had any, there were card games. I never, they were played by the older group.
What else can you think of that you'd like to say? Maybe something I hadn't, oh wait, there was one other question. What stories do you have about the bocce? Didn't you tell me once that women couldn't play, but one time the women did get to play? And isn't that kind of a...
Well, we've got in the bocce players at Taneytown were very upset with the museum, Springdale Museum. Alan Lord is director of the Springdale Museum, and she had these T-shirts made that said you don't have to have balls to play bocce. And all of us women from Shiloh went out and played bocce against the men, which they they to this day never appreciate it. But bocce is a very interesting game, and the men at Taneytown take it very, very seriously. Raleigh Tesaro is a very good friend of mine, and Raleigh is a tremendous bocce player. In fact, they had the Spring Fest at where you were there. Raleigh was teaching younger men how to play.
Let's see. What else is there anything else you want to say before I move on to the last few questions?
My memories of Taneytown, it was during the Depression, but I really never knew there was a Depression because we always had enough to eat, we always had good friends, and I don't think that people who lived on farms in small communities felt the stress that people in cities and small towns did. Because if you had food and were taken care of, you just didn't realize how serious it was.
If someone who had never been to Taneytown, they didn't know anything about Taneytown, said, "Mary, tell me about your little hometown of Taneytown," what would you tell them?
I would tell them Taneytown was a small community where there was an ethnic group, Italians, that everyone in the community knew one another and basically were of the same religion. And that in the earlier years, even into the 50s, there was a lot of prejudice against Taneytown. One of my first jobs was at First National Bank, and my boss was a deacon in the First Baptist Church and a most wonderful man you'll ever meet in your life. And he shielded me from a lot of prejudice. There was a lot of mistrust, and the editor of the Springdale News, John P. Stafford, when the Taneytown was being settled, had an article in the paper about the Daigles coming, be careful. And years later, he rescinded it and apologized and said that he was out of line and he didn't know what a great people they were. But growing up, what I would tell anyone about Taneytown is there is a lot of generosity, a lot of goodwill, and the people are friendly and interesting.
Okay, let's see if you can finish this sentence for me. My favorite thing about Taneytown is?
My favorite thing about Taneytown is the people, the community. All of my memories and the people that I knew growing up, and the people that are there today. We never locked a door, and we lived on the highway. And I don't think anyone ever locked a door. My mother never turned away a stranger. There was always a way to find a place on the back porch for them to sleep at night or a meal for them. And I think that speaks for the whole community. There's a lot of generosity and goodwill. They're a stubborn breed, I'll say that. And but I think that as small communities go, it probably, you could knock on any neighbor's door and ask for a favor and it would be granted.
This collection, I think you called it the Denali collection. What was it and why was it so important?
The Denali sisters kept everything, and they had all the photographs that Father Bandini and a friend of his who was a photographer from Rogers had made. There was a picture of every Italian family with the documentation of who they were. And there was all the correspondence that Father Bandini had. Father Bandini had a housekeeper who was one of the correspondents that wrote the articles about Taneytown for the newspaper. But the Bandini girls, they were there. They helped. That was his secretary, and they were his housekeepers. So they kept all of. They had postcards. They had all the information of how he got along with or didn't get along with the bishops, and he would do it and then ask permission. And really, I don't think that we would have survived if he hadn't. The one thing Father Bandini did that I always regretted was he said, "You are now Americans, you will speak English." And when I started school, because my mother was Irish, we spoke English in the home. But a lot of my friends could not speak English in the first grade. And they were very, very hard on them. I know one of my friends, this nun, said, "You're not going to get any bread till you say it in English." And Father Bandini, even earlier than that, insisted that they learned the English language and dropped the Italian. Well, the mothers and dads and grandparents, didn't. But the children we lost our language. And I have friends who are Hispanic, and I tell every one of them, don't you let your children lose their language. You need to keep your language.